Welcome to Forgotten History Daily. I am William, and tonight we into one of history's most fascinating and darkest stories. On the night of July 30th, 1919, a white mob descended on Washington Park in Chicago, Illinois, with a singular mission: to destroy the black community that lived there. What began as a brutal beating of an African-American teenager, Eugene Williams, would escalate into a 36-hour period of unrelenting violence, leaving at least 38 people dead. As we delve into this forgotten chapter in American history, it's essential to understand the context in which these events unfolded. The Great War had left the nation reeling, with returning soldiers struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. The Red Scare of communism and radicalism was at its peak, fueling racial tension eventually boil over. But what transpired in Washington Park that fateful night was not an isolated incident. Rather, it was a symptom of a nationwide epidemic of white mob violence against African American communities. Over the course of 1919, such attacks would ravage 26 cities across America, leaving in their wake a trail of bloodshed and terror. From Omaha to Knoxville, from Chicago to Washington, D.C., African Americans were targeted by angry mobs, often with the tacit approval or outright complicity of local authorities. The most egregious incidents occurred in the summer of 1919, earning this period the title of the Red Summer. We'll examine the factors that contributed to these outbreaks, including economic competition. Tonight's story is a sobering reminder that the United States has yet to fully confront its troubled history. The horrors of 1919's Red Summer remain disturbingly relevant today, as we grapple with ongoing issues of systematic racism, police brutality, and community mistrust. By exploring this dark chapter in American history, we hope to shed light on the struggles of a forgotten generation, and perhaps, by doing so, we may just find a glimmer of hope for a more just and equitable future. As the summer of 1919 reached its peak, the nation was ablaze with racial tension. The horrors of Washington Park's Red Summer had set off a chain reaction of violent attacks across the country. One of the most devastating incidents took place in Chicago, where a 12-hour riot would leave 23 people dead and over 1,000 injured. The trouble began on July 27th, when Eugene Williams, an African-American teenager, was accused of touching a white woman's hand at a beach in Chicago's South Side. A white mob formed quickly, fueled by rage and resentment. Over the next 12 hours, African-American neighborhoods were ravaged, with mobs burning homes, businesses, and churches to the ground. The violence was not just random, it was systemic. The police, who had initially been slow to respond to the crisis, eventually arrived on the scene, but failed to restore order. In fact, many officers openly participated in the attacks, using their badges as shields, while they vandalized African-American property. The Chicago riot was particularly significant because of its sheer scale and brutality. It was one of the worst instances of racial violence in U.S. history, and it left a lasting scar on the city's African-American community. The incident sparked national outrage, with many newspapers condemning the action of police and calling for greater protections for civil rights. But Chicago's riot was not an isolated incident. Across America, similar attacks were unfolding. In Omaha, Nebraska, a mob of 3,000 whites descended upon the African-American neighborhood of Logan Park, burning homes and businesses to the ground. The city's mayor eventually called in troops to quell the violence, but not before several people were killed. In Knoxville, Tennessee, a white woman was accused of being attacked by an African-American man, sparking a violent backlash against the local black community. The police responded with force, shooting and arresting dozens of African Americans who were simply trying to protect their homes. The Red Summer of 1919 was not just about random acts of violence. It was a systematic attack on the existence of African American communities in America. It was a reminder that the United States had yet to fully confront its legacy of slavery, segregation, and racial inequality. As we explore these events further, we'll examine the role of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who were emboldened by the Red Scare and the rise of anti-communist sentiment. We'll also look at the ways in which local authorities often facilitated or ignored these attacks, perpetuating a cycle of violence that has continued to this day. But amidst the horror and tragedy of 1919's Red Summer, there are stories of resilience and resistance. African American communities banded together, forming self-defense leagues and advocating for their rights through peaceful protest. These brave individuals knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were determined to fight for a more just and equitable society. As we continue our journey into this forgotten chapter in American history, we'll delve deeper into these stories of courage and activism. We'll explore the ways in which the Red Summer of 1919 set the stage for future civil rights movements, including the Harlem Renaissance and the Montgomery bus boycott. And we'll examine how the horrors of that summer continue to resonate today, informing ongoing struggles against systemic racism and police brutality. The legacy of 1919's Red Summer is complex and multifaceted, but one thing is clear: it remains a powerful reminder of America's unfinished business when it comes to racial equality and justice. The summer of 1919 was a sweltering heatwave that engulfed the United States. But it was not just the mercury that soared to record highs. Tensions between whites and blacks had been simmering for months, building towards a catastrophic confrontation that would leave a lasting scar on America's conscience. As we delve deeper into this pivotal moment in history, let us set the scene. It is June 1919. And the country is still reeling from the Great War. The streets are filled with returning veterans, their eyes haunted by the memories of the trenches, and their minds struggling to adjust to civilian life. But amidst this sense of uncertainty and disillusionment, a different kind of conflict was brewing. For African Americans, the post-war era had brought little of economic or social advancement. Many had fought bravely for their country, only to be met with racism and segregation in return. Jobs were scarce, housing inadequate, and opportunities non-existent. It was a recipe for disaster, and one that would soon come to a head in cities across America. Consider the vibrant city of Philadelphia, once known as the city of brotherly love. By 1919, it had become a hotbed of racial tension, with whites and blacks living in increasingly segregated neighborhoods. The African American community was growing rapidly, driven by the influx of migrants from the rural South. But instead of being welcomed as equals, met with slurring and hostility. One of the most significant factors contributing to this atmosphere of hatred was the rise of mass media. Newspapers like the Philadelphia Tribune and the Chicago Defender were becoming increasingly influential, but they often fueled racial animosity through sensationalized reporting and inflammatory editorials. The Negro problem was a constant refrain, with many outlets perpetuating stereotypes and myths about African American behavior. In this toxic environment, small incidents could quickly escalate into full-blown riots. A rumor of an interracial incident might spark a wave of violence, leaving innocent lives in its wake. It was a powder keg waiting to ignite, and it would not be long before the first embers were kindled. On June 10, 1919, a major explosion rocked Washington, D.C., as a mob of whites attacked African American residents of the city's LaDroit Park neighborhood. The violence was swift and merciless, with reports of homes being vandalized, businesses destroyed, and innocent people beaten or killed. It would be one of many such incidents that summer, each leaving its own unique scar on the nation's psyche. As we navigate this treacherous terrain, it is essential to understand the social context in which these events unfolded. America was a deeply segregated society, with strict laws governing everything from education and employment to housing and healthcare. The Ku Klux Klan, that most insidious of white supremacist organizations, was enjoying a resurgence in popularity, with its ideology of racial purity and violence spreading like wildfire across the country. But what drove this hatred? Was it simply a matter of economics, as some historians have argued? Or were there deeper psychological forces at play, rooted in centuries of colonialism, slavery, and oppression? One thing is certain: America's collective conscience was in a state of turmoil. The ideals of liberty and equality, enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, seemed increasingly distant from the harsh realities on the ground. As we explore this complex events, let us not forget that 1919 was also a time of great cultural upheaval. In Harlem, the legendary jazz musician and composer W.C. Handy was busy experimenting with new sounds and styles, blending traditional African-American music with elements of European classical music to create something entirely fresh and original. In Chicago, the poet Countee Cullen was making waves with his powerful verse, speaking directly to the experiences of Black Americans in a world that seemed determined to silence them. These were not just isolated incidents. They represented a broader shift in America's cultural landscape. The Jazz Age had begun, with its emphasis on improvisation and spontaneity, reflecting the country's growing sense of restlessness and discontent. But amidst this ferment, a sinister undercurrent was also at work. The Red Scare, sparked by fears of Bolshevism and communism, was casting a long shadow across America, fueling xenophobia and paranoia in equal measure. Whites were pitted against immigrants, blacks against whites, and the very concept of American identity began to fray at the seams. In this maelstrom of conflicting emotions and interests, it is remarkable that African Americans were able to maintain any sense of dignity or resilience at all. Yet resist they did, through acts of quiet courage and defiance in the face of overwhelming oppression. Consider the story of Ida B. Wells, a pioneering journalist and civil rights activist who had been sounding the alarm about racial violence for over 2 decades. In 1919, she was at the forefront of the anti-lynching movement, using her pen to expose the horrors committed by white mobs across America. Or think of the remarkable efforts of black clergy, like the Reverend Jesse Max Barber, who worked tirelessly to organize self-defense leagues and advocate for greater civil rights protections. These were not just heroic individuals. They represented a broader tradition of African American activism that would continue to shape the country's future. As we journey deeper into this red summer, we will encounter countless such stories of bravery and resistance. We will witness the seeds of future social movements being sown in the fertile ground of 1919. And we will be forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that America's struggle for racial equality is far from over. As we delve deeper into the red summer of 1919, it becomes clear that the violence was not limited to any one region or city. From Washington, D.C. to Chicago, Illinois, Knoxville, Tennessee, and Omaha, Nebraska, cities across America witnessed wave after wave of racist attacks, each with its own unique characteristics and consequences. In Washington, D.C., the summer's racial tensions came to a head on July 19th, when a white mob descended upon the city's African American community in the Foggy Bottom neighborhood. Over a period of several hours, the rioters attacked homes, businesses, and churches, leaving a trail of destruction and despair in their wake. One of the most horrific incidents occurred at some place, Phillips Episcopal Church, where dozens of worshippers were forced to take refuge from the mob. The church's rector, Reverend William M. Thurer, stood bravely against the rioters, shielding his flock with his body as they hurled rocks and bricks through the church windows. As the violence raged on, Mayor Anderson of Washington, D.C. struggled to maintain, deploying troops to quell the uprising. But even these efforts were hampered by a lack of adequate resources and support from local authorities. Meanwhile, in Chicago, tensions between black and white residents had been simmering for months. The The city's African-American population had grown significantly during World War I, as thousands of blacks migrated from the rural South to take advantage of industrial job opportunities. But their arrival was met with resentment by many whites, who saw them as a threat to their economic status. On July 27, that tension finally boiled over into violence when a white mob stormed the city's African-American community on the South. For several days, rioters attacked homes, businesses, and schools, leaving at least 38 people dead and hundreds more injured. As the bodies piled up in Chicago, Mayor William E. Dever struggled to keep pace with the unfolding disaster. He deployed troops and police units to quell the uprising, but his efforts were often hamstrung by a lack of coordination between different branches of government. In other cities across America, similar scenes played out on a smaller scale. In Knoxville, Tennessee, a white mob attacked the city's African-American community in August 1919, burning homes and businesses to the ground. In Omaha, Nebraska, a group of white men stormed the local black community on June 28, resulting in the deaths of at least 8 people. As the violence raged on, many Americans were left wondering what had caused this explosion of racial hatred. Was it the growing sense of restlessness and discontent among whites, or the long-simmering resentment over economic competition between blacks and whites? Or was something more sinister at work, a calculated effort by powerful interests to exploit racial tensions for their own gain? Whatever the cause, one thing was clear. The Red Summer of 1919 marked a turning point in American history. For African Americans, it would be a summer of bloodshed, terror, and tragedy. But for many whites, it would also represent a moment of reckoning, a realization that their long-held privileges and power structures were under threat from a rapidly changing world. In the face of this chaos, Ida B. Wells and other black leaders continued to sound the alarm about racial violence. Their pleas fell on deaf ears in some quarters, but they refused to be silenced by the mobs and their enablers. "We are tired of these murders," Wells wrote in an editorial for the Chicago Defender. "We are tired of being treated as less than human beings. We demand justice. We demand equality. We demand justice. We demand equality. We demand justice. We demand equality. We demand that our rights be respected." As the summer drew to a close, many of those responsible for the violence would go unpunished, while African victims and survivors would struggle to rebuild their shattered lives. But in the midst of this devastation, something unexpected happened, a glimmer of hope. For in the face of overwhelming oppression, African Americans refused to be silenced or defeated. Instead, they began to organize, mobilize, and resist, laying the groundwork for future social movements that would shake America to its core. In the words of Ida B. Wells, the Red Summer will not go down in history as a stain on our nation's conscience. It will go down as a call to action, a reminder of what we must do to create a world where all people can live with dignity and respect. The summer of 1919, a time when the fabric of American society, it was as if the very foundations of racial coexistence had been laid bare, revealing the deep-seated fears, prejudices, and powers that had long simmered beneath the surface. In cities across America, a toxic stew of hatred and mistrust was brewing, fueled by economic competition, urban migration, and the post-war anxieties of returning soldiers. As the nation struggled to find its footing in a rapidly changing world, white working-class Americans began to feel increasingly threatened by the growing presence of African American migrants. They were moving into their neighborhoods, taking jobs they believed rightfully belonged to them. The fear of being pushed aside, of losing status and privilege, was palpable. It's a primal instinct, one that would ultimately prove disastrous for both communities. In Washington, D.C., a new face emerged on the national stage. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Appointed by President Woodrow Wilson in 1919, Palmer was a man consumed by his own ambition and a zeal to root out perceived threats to American security. He saw radicalism and anarchy lurking in every shadow, and with the Red Scare still casting its ominous presence over the nation, Palmer was determined to prove himself as a champion of order. But what began as a crusade against Bolshevism would soon turn to targeting African Americans and immigrants. The boundaries between politics and prejudice blurred, allowing Palmer's fervor to feed into the growing white supremacist movement sweeping across America. His zealous tactics would soon have far-reaching consequences for countless lives. In Philadelphia, a seemingly unrelated event was unfolding: the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1909 by William English Walling and Mary White Ovington. This fledgling organization aimed to fight racial injustice through non-violent means. Little did they know that their efforts would soon be put to the test like never before. As tension simmered beneath the surface, a set of seemingly isolated incidents erupted into full-blown violence. On May 30th, in Longview, Texas, a white mob attacked an African-American tent colony, leaving 2 people dead and several more injured. The brutality was appalling, but it was only the beginning. In July, a wave of racial clashes shook cities from Arkansas to New York. At their epicenter lay Philadelphia, where on August 1st, 1919, a white mob marched through the city's African-American neighborhood, brandishing guns and torches. 5 people killed that day, but it would be just one more in a long series of senseless massacres. Meanwhile, Attorney General Palmer continued to escalate his efforts against perceived radicals, while the likes of Senator Theodore G. Bilbo of Mississippi stoked racial hatred with impassioned speeches. Bilbo's words dripped with venom. "I do not think we should take any of these racial slurs into this country." The poison seeped deep, corroding any remaining vestiges of goodwill between communities. As the nation's leadership turned a blind eye to the horrors unfolding in cities across America, local authorities struggled to contain the chaos. Their efforts were hampered by entrenched racism and outdated notions of order. How could a system designed to preserve power structures possibly begin to address such gross injustices? But amidst this mayhem, there are those who refuse to be silenced. Ordinary people driven by their own experiences of suffering and injustice. They whispered stories in dark alleys and huddled together in secret meetings, forging bonds that would eventually ignite a firestorm of resistance. These individuals understood the stakes. Nothing less than the future of America's very soul hung in the balance. Theirs was a battle against the entrenched interests that had for so long wielded power and control over marginalized communities, a fight against systemic racism, not just its symptoms. Their struggles would set off a chain reaction, awakening others to join them. But it wouldn't be easy. Fear of reprisal was palpable. Families cowered in fear as mobs rampaged through their neighborhoods, leaving death, destruction, and despair in their wake. Yet even amidst such devastation, glimmers of hope flickered. The spark of resistance that had long been smoldering within African American communities began to spread. It would grow into a flame that would illuminate not only their own struggles, but those of others across America, illuminating the darkest recesses of human nature and prompting hard questions about power, privilege, and what it means. The Red Summer of 1919 had arrived, a cauldron of hate, violence, and suffering. It's a story we must confront head-on if we are ever to understand the darker aspects of our own collective past. As the summer of 1919 wore on, the bloodshed continued unabated. In Chicago, the city's west side was ablaze with violence, as white mobs clashed with African American residents in a wave of attacks that would become known as the East Side Riot. The police, who had initially seemed more interested in Washington, D.C., where tensions between African Americans and white police officers had been simmering for months, a brutal series of attacks on black residents left at least 6 dead. The violence was so severe that even President Woodrow Wilson's administration seemed shocked into action. deploying federal troops to quell the unrest. Meanwhile, in Omaha, Nebraska, a tragic confrontation between African-American veterans and a white police officer sparked one of intense outbreaks of violence. After a series of escalating skirmishes, a group of white militiamen stormed through the city's predominantly black neighborhood, firing rifles and throwing grenades at terrified residents. In the aftermath, 19 people would be killed and hundreds more displaced. Yet, even as these atrocities unfolded, there were signs that the tide was beginning to turn. As African-American communities began to organize in response to the violence, they found themselves galvanized by a new sense of purpose and solidarity. Outraged by the brutality meted out against them, ordinary people from all walks of life, including women, children, and even some white allies, began to mobilize. In cities like Kansas City, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, small but determined groups of activists started holding secret meetings and planning coordinated protests. They drew inspiration from the likes of W.E.B. Du Bois, the influential African-American scholar and activist who had long argued that racism was a fundamentally structural problem in America, one that could only be solved through collective action. As these fledgling movements gained momentum, they faced fierce resistance from entrenched power structures, which saw their efforts as a direct threat to establish social order. In some cases, police and politicians actively worked to suppress the protests, labeling organizers as agitators or worse. But despite these challenges, the spirit of resistance continued to spread. In the midst of this chaos, ordinary people began to tell stories that had long been suppressed, tales of everyday struggles against racism, of acts of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. They spoke of families torn apart by violence, of lives lost and destroyed through no fault of their own, and they spoke too of resilience, of the unyielding will to survive, to thrive, and to demand justice. These voices would soon rise above the din of hatred and fear that had consumed so much of America in 1919. They would help forge a new narrative about what it means to be an American, one that acknowledges not just the horrors of racism, but also the power of resistance, solidarity, and collective action. It was a story that would haunt the nation for generations to come. Reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, and always a fight worth waging. The Red Summer of 1919 had left an indelible mark on the nation, but as the year drew to a close, there were whispers of a new wave of violence brewing in the city of Chicago. The summer's events had been a wake-up call for many Americans, exposing the deep-seated racism and racial tensions that threatened to boil over into chaos. On September 28th, a crowd of around 3,000 African-American workers gathered outside the Union stockyards, where they had been employed in the city's meatpacking industry. Tensions between black and white workers had been simmering for months, but on this particular day, something snapped. A scuffle broke out between two groups of workers, and soon the entire area erupted into chaos. Eyewitness accounts described the scene as one of utter mayhem, with rocks and bricks flying through the air, and punches being thrown by both sides. The violence was so intense that police were forced to intervene, but even they struggled to maintain control. "I saw a man shot in the back," recalled one witness. "He fell to the ground, and I thought he was dead for sure." Another described seeing a group of black workers fleeing through the streets, pursued by a mob of white men armed with clubs and knives. As the violence spilled out onto the city streets, Mayor William Hale Thompson was quick to respond. He called in a unit of police officers from the nearby town of Blue Island, who were tasked with quelling the unrest. But as they arrived on the scene, it became clear that the situation was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. The violence wasn't just limited to the Union stockyards. It had spread throughout the city's African-American neighborhoods, where residents were terrorized by roving gangs of white men. Homes were ransacked, businesses looted, and women and children were forced to flee for their lives. It was like a war zone, said one resident, who asked not to be named. We were trapped in our own neighborhood with no way out. The Red Summer's most notorious perpetrator, the Chicago Tribune's editor-in-chief, Robert McCormick, saw fit to describe the violence as nothing more than a Negro. This wasn't just about black people, said Reverend Frederick McGee, a prominent African-American minister who had been with the city's black community. This was about white Americans were to accept us as equal citizens. As the violence continued to escalate, it became clear that the authorities were struggling to keep up. On October 1st, a group of African-American residents attempted to flee their homes in the city's north side, only to be met with gunfire from a group of white men. It was like they had declared war on us, said one survivor. We tried to run, but there were too many of them. We thought we'd never make it out alive. The scenes that unfolded over the next few days would become some of the most infamous in American history. On October 2nd, a group of white men attacked an African-American family in their home on 49th Street, leaving 2 people dead and several more injured. It was like they had come to kill us, said one survivor. We barricaded ourselves inside, but they just kept coming. As the violence continued to spread, the city's African-American community began to organize in response. On October 3rd, a group of residents gathered at the Ebenezer Baptist Church to plan their next move. We knew we had to stand up for ourselves, said one organizer. We couldn't just sit back and let this happen. The church meeting would prove to be a turning point in the Red Summer's narrative. As African-American residents began to mobilize, they found themselves drawing strength from each other and from the growing sense of solidarity that was sweeping across the nation. It was like we had finally woken up, said Reverend McKee. We realized that we didn't have to accept this violence as a way of life. But even as the community began to organize, there were those who sought to suppress their efforts. Mayor Thompson and other city officials continued to downplay the violence, labeling it as nothing more than a riot or a disturbance. It was like they thought we were just making it all up, said one organizer. But we knew what we had seen. We knew that this was something far bigger than a simple riot. As the Red Summer drew to a close, it became clear that America's racial fault lines would never be the same again. The violence had deep-seated tensions that would continue to simmer beneath the surface for decades to come. But even as the dust settled on the Red Summer's ashes, there was a glimmer of hope on the horizon. A new generation of African-American leaders was emerging, determined to challenge the status quo and fight for equality in all its forms. It was like we had finally found our voice, said one organizer. We knew that we would never be silenced again. The Red Summer's legacy would live on for generations to come, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a fight worth waging. But as we close this chapter in American history, we are left with more questions than answers. What led to this violence? Who was responsible and who bore the blame? And most pressing of all, what lessons can be learned from this dark period in America's past? The truth is that the Red Summer remains a cautionary tale for our times, a reminder that racism is never just a relic of the past, but a living, breathing force that continues to shape our world today. As we continue our journey through the forgotten corners of American history, we will encounter more stories like this one. We will meet individuals who fought against overwhelming odds and communities that struggled for justice in the face of brutal oppression. But as we listen to their tales, let us remember the lessons of the Red Summer, that resistance is a fundamental human right, that solidarity is the only true path forward, and that even in the darkest of times, as we delve deeper into the Red Summer's aftermath, it becomes clear that the violence had a profound impact on the country. The scale of the destruction was staggering. Over 200 African Americans were killed, countless more injured, and thousands left homeless. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, leaving families to pick up the pieces and rebuild their shattered lives. The federal government, however, seemed reluctant to take decisive action. Despite mounting pressure from civil rights leaders and outraged citizens, President Woodrow Wilson's administration remained largely silent on the matter. It wasn't until months later, in 1920, that Congress finally passed a resolution condemning the violence and calling for greater protection of African American lives. But even as lawmakers struggled to come to terms with the Red Summer's severity, the nation was already moving on. The world was changing rapidly. World War I had ended just 2 years earlier, and the country was caught up in the excitement of the Roaring Twenties. Prohibition was sweeping the nation, jazz music was all the rage, and flappers were shaking up social norms. For many African Americans, however, the Red Summer's horrors seemed to fade into the background as they struggled to rebuild their lives. The violence had exposed deep-seated fears about racial hierarchy, but it also sparked a renewed sense of resilience and determination among black communities. As one historian noted, the Red Summer was not just an event, it was a catalyst for change. It forced African Americans to confront the brutal realities of racism head-on, and to find ways to organize, resist, and fight back. In the aftermath of the violence, new leaders began to emerge on the figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, who had been calling for a more radical approach to civil rights for years, gained widespread attention for his unflinching critiques of systemic racism. Meanwhile, younger activists, including men and women who would go on to become some of the 20th century's most influential figures, began to find their voices. This was an era when African American literature, music, and art were exploding onto the national stage. Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, and Zora Neale Hurston were among those pushing the boundaries of artistic expression, while figures like Duke Ellington and Bessie Smith were pioneering new sounds in jazz and blues. For black artists, activists, and intellectuals, the Red Summer's violence served as a clarion call, a reminder that their work was not just about aesthetics or entertainment, but about challenging the state. As Hughes himself wrote, "We are the children of America, born in this land, raised to be its citizens, but we are also its outcasts, forever bound to the fringes of society, forced to navigate a landscape that's always hostile, always treacherous." This dichotomy was at the heart of the Red Summer, a moment when American society, as historian Eric Foner noted, the Red Summer was not just about black-white tensions, it was also about class divisions, urban-rural conflicts, and the broader struggle for social justice in America. But for African Americans, the Red Summer's aftermath served as a turning point, a moment when they realized that their voices mattered, their stories needed to be told, and their fight for equality would not be silenced. The Red Summer's aftermath, a period of profound transformation for African American communities across the United States. As the nation continued to evolve in the 1920s, the scars of racial violence lingered, yet so too did a sense of hope and determination among black leaders. One lesser-known figure who emerged during this time was Carter G. Woodson, an education historian who would go on to found the Association Study of Negro Life and History. In his seminal work, The Miseducation of the Negro, Woodson tackled the elephant in the room, systematic racism within the American educational system. Published in 1933, this book offered a scathing critique of how black students were taught to accept inferior status, rather than challenging racist ideologies head-on. Woodson's work would become a rallying cry for activists, who began to recognize the importance of education as a tool for social change. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, a wave of African American migration swept through Detroit, Michigan in 1926. Thousands flocked to the city seeking economic opportunities, but found instead a bleak reality. Housing shortages and racial segregation forced many into cramped, unsanitary conditions. In the midst of this chaos, a small group of black women would become instrumental in organizing relief efforts. Their leader was Jessie DePriest, wife of prominent civil rights activist Oscar DePriest, who had been elected to Congress just 2 years prior. Jesse's tireless work behind the scenes helped raise awareness about the plight of black migrants and led to significant changes within Detroit's social services infrastructure. Her example would inspire countless others to take on leadership roles in their communities. However, not all responses to the Red Summer were as altruistic. The Ku Klux Klan, ever vigilant for opportunities to exploit racial tensions, began to regroup in the 1920s. They saw the growing influence of African American leaders and intellectuals as a threat, and launched a series of high-profile campaigns aimed at intimidating their opponents. One notable target was Philip Randolph, a charismatic union organizer who had been instrumental in galvanizing black workers' efforts to demand better wages and working conditions. Randolph's unapologetic criticism of systematic racism and his tireless advocacy for labor rights had made him a thorn in the side of many white supremacists. In 1929, the year that stock markets crashed and sparked the Great Depression, Randolph launched a daring campaign to end segregation on Washington, D.C. streetcars. Faced with violent opposition from KKK sympathizers, Randolph refused to back down, instead organizing hundreds of protesters who stormed the streets in defiance of discriminatory practices. As the 1930s unfolded, tensions continued to escalate between African American communities and law enforcement agencies nationwide. In Memphis, Tennessee, for instance, a wave of police brutality culminated in the notorious Beale Street Massacre of 1925. On that fateful night, white officers opened fire on a group of black residents attending a dance, leaving several dead and many more injured. This era also saw the rise of paramilitary groups like the Black Legion, which pledged to cleanse America's cities of perceived racial threats. In some cases, organizations openly collaborated with local police departments, feeding into systematic racism rather than combating it. One lesser-known chapter in this saga is the story of Robert Moton, a former educator turned activist who witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of redlining and housing segregation. In his 1929 book, What I Saw at the Tulsa Disaster, Moton exposed the dark secrets surrounding the 1921 Tulsa Massacre, where a white mob killed an estimated 300. Moton's testimony brought renewed attention to the issue of racial violence, yet also underscored the need for collective action. He founded the Tuskegee Institute's Department of Socioeconomy and Sociology, establishing it as a hub for social research and activism on issues affecting African American communities. Despite these challenges, a new era of artistic expression had begun in earnest. The Harlem Renaissance, though sometimes romanticized as an explosion of creative genius, without acknowledging its roots in resistance against systemic racism, produced works that continue to captivate audiences today. One pivotal figure was Sterling Brown, a poet and educator who helped shape the movement's early years through his groundbreaking anthology, The Negro in American Fiction. By examining the ways in which white authors portrayed black characters, Brown highlighted the urgent need for authentic representation in literature. Brown's ideas would find echoes in future generations of writers. Yet, there remains a more subtle yet crucial connection between this era and the persistence of systemic racism within institutions. Today, as protests over police brutality, racial disparities in education, and economic inequality continue to grip headlines, listeners might recognize an uncanny familiarity with these earlier struggles. In other words, the wounds inflicted by the Red Summer have not fully healed. They still linger beneath the surface, waiting for justice, equality, or simply a resounding acknowledgement of existence. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of history, that it often serves as both a chronicle and a prophecy. As the years went by, the scars of the Red Summer refused to fade. In 1922, a similar wave of racial violence swept through Chicago, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction in the black community of Bronzeville. The city's newspapers estimated that over 40 people were killed, with countless more injured or displaced. This time, however, there was a sense of collective outrage that had not been seen before. White labor unions, who had previously turned a blind eye to racist violence, began to speak out against the attacks on black communities. Their newfound solidarity was largely driven by the efforts of Robert Senstacker-Bat, a newspaper publisher and civil rights leader who had founded the Chicago Defender in 1905. The Defender's bold editorials and headlines helped galvanize public opinion, painting a vivid picture of the horrors faced by African Americans at the hands of white mobs. As the city teetered on the brink of chaos, Abbott's paper issued a stern warning. If the authorities fail to take prompt action, there will be another race war in Chicago. In response to this escalating crisis, Attorney General Mitchell Palmer began to mobilize federal resources to combat racial violence. The Justice Department launched an investigation into the Chicago riots, and Palmer himself flew to the city to survey the damage. Though his efforts would ultimately prove insufficient to stem the tide of bloodshed, they marked a turning point in the federal government's willingness to confront the issue. Meanwhile, the seeds sown by the Red Summer began to bear fruit in unexpected ways. The NAACP, once a relatively small and underfunded organization, had gained momentum as a result of its tireless advocacy on behalf of racial justice. By 1922, the group boasted over 500 local chapters across the country, mobilizing grassroots activists who were determined to push for change. One such activist was Carter G. Woodson, an African-American historian and educator who would go on to become one of the most influential figures in the civil rights movement. In his seminal work, The Miseducation of the Negro, published just a year after the Red Summer, Woodson laid bare the insidious legacy of segregation and racism that had been perpetuated through education. By highlighting the ways in which schools and universities reinforced white supremacy, Woodson aimed to galvanize African-American communities into action. This era also saw the rise of more militant voices, like those of the Negro nationalist movement. Founded by the charismatic and incendiary Marcus Garvey, this Pan-Africanist group advocated for racial self-defense and economic empowerment, ideals that would later influence figures such as Malcolm X and Martin Luther. As we delve deeper into the tangled history of the Red Summer, it becomes increasingly clear that its impact extends far beyond the immediate aftermath. The trauma inflicted on African-American communities that fateful summer left behind a legacy of pain, anger, and determination, all of which continue to reverberate through our society today. As we've witnessed the unfolding of the Red Summer, a chapter in American history that would etch it into the collective consciousness like a scar, it's essential to continue our narrative forward, exploring the long-term consequences and the months following the bloodshed saw a glimmer of hope as the federal government acknowledged its failure to prevent or mitigate the violence. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, while criticized for his response, did launch an investigation into the Chicago riots and mobilized Justice Department resources to combat racial violence. This nascent awareness marked a turning point in the nation's willingness to confront the issue. Yet, despite these efforts, the aftermath of the Red Summer remained shrouded in uncertainty. No comprehensive record was kept of the total number of lives lost or communities destroyed across the 26 affected cities. Many incidents were never documented at all, and the exact circumstances surrounding individual tragedies remain a myth. One such example is the burning of the S.A. James African Methodist Episcopal Church in Knoxville, Tennessee. This historic sanctuary had served as a safe haven for countless African Americans during the summer's turmoil. Yet its significance was overlooked by subsequent historians until relatively recently. The church's very existence serves as a poignant reminder that even in the face of overwhelming violence, Black communities maintained hope and resilience. As we reflect on this period, it becomes increasingly clear that the trauma inflicted on African American communities has left an indelible mark on American society. A 1922 report by the Chicago Commission on Race Relations highlighted the extent to which racial violence had eroded trust between the government and marginalized communities. The Red Summer had demonstrated that when push came to shove, many authorities were either unwilling or incapable of protecting their most vulnerable citizens. Fast forwarding to the present day, we can identify a striking continuity in this pattern of events. Despite the passing of over a century, racial tensions persist, and instances of police brutality, systematic racism, and community disintegration continue to plague American society. The legacy of the Red Summer also echoes through the lives of those directly affected by it. Many families forced to flee their homes during the violence found themselves scattered across the country, separated from one another for generations to come. Others were forever marked by the trauma they experienced, passing down stories and scars through family lines. One of the most significant long-term consequences of the Red Summer lies in its impact on American politics. The 1919 riots galvanized a new wave of civil rights activism, setting the stage for landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Martin Luther King Jr., whose own experiences with racism were deeply influenced by the events of that summer, drew inspiration from the bravery and resilience of those who fought against oppression. Now, let's pivot to what this story teaches us today about power, money, trust, government, and protecting ourselves. As we reflect on the tumultuous events of 1919, we're reminded that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, individuals can exert their influence through collective action. Practical lesson number 1. Building trust during the Red Summer. It became clear that when communities don't feel protected or heard by their governments, they will take matters into their own hands. This echoes a timeless truism: trust is earned, not given. To safeguard our well-being and promote positive change, we must prioritize building genuine connections with those around us. In today's world, where social media dominates our interactions, it's easy to lose sight of the human touch. By fostering meaningful relationships within our neighborhoods and local communities, we can create a foundation for trust that will serve as a bulwark against future conflicts. Practical lesson number 2. Harnessing economic power. Marcus Garvey's Negro nationalist movement championed economic empowerment as a key component of racial self-defense. Today, we understand the crucial role that financial stability plays in protecting ourselves from exploitation and oppression. By investing in local businesses, supporting community-led initiatives, and advocating for policies that promote economic equity, we can begin to break free from systems designed to keep us marginalized. Practical lesson number 3. Challenging power structures. The Red Summer exposed the deep-seated power imbalances within American society. We see this same dynamic at play in contemporary discussions around police brutality. Gentrification, and systemic racism. To create meaningful change, we must continue to challenge these entrenched systems by holding our leaders accountable for actions. This requires us to engage with the complexities of power dynamics, working alongside marginalized voices to dismantle structures that perpetuate inequality. Practical lesson number 4. Cultivating resilience throughout this narrative. We've witnessed individuals, communities, and organizations displaying remarkable resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. The lesson is clear. Our collective strength lies not in avoidance or complacency, but in embracing our shared humanity. As we reflect on the lives lost during the Red Summer, let us draw inspiration from their unyielding spirit. By acknowledging our own vulnerabilities, listening around us, and cultivating a sense of solidarity, we can begin to heal the wounds inflicted by history's darkest moments. In the end, it is not merely a matter of confronting the past, but of harnessing its lessons to forge a brighter future, one where every individual has an equal voice in shaping their destiny. As we close this chapter on the Red Summer, let us carry with us the indomitable spirit of those who came before, armed with the knowledge that our collective action can transcend even the darkest of times. As we conclude our exploration of the Red Summer, it's essential to acknowledge the impact it had on the nation. The violent clashes between white mobs and African American communities in 1919 marked a turning point in the civil rights movement. The widespread destruction and loss of life sent shockwaves throughout the country, leaving an indelible mark on the social and political landscape. The Red Summer was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern of racial violence that had been building for decades. However, the sheer scale and brutality of these attacks in 1919 galvanized public opinion and sparked a renewed effort to address systemic racism. The NAACP, just over 2 decades earlier, by W.E.B. Du Bois and other visionaries, emerged as a leading voice in the fight against racial injustice. One notable figure who played a crucial role in this movement was Ida B. Wells, a journalist and activist who had been documenting racial violence for years. Wells' reporting on the Red Summer helped bring national attention to the issue, exposing the systematic failures that allowed these atrocities to occur. Her work also highlighted the importance of grassroots organizing and community-based activism. As we examine the legacy of the Red Summer, it's striking to note how many of the same themes continue to resonate today. The struggle for economic empowerment, the need to challenge entrenched power structures, and the importance of cultivating resilience in the face of adversity are all timeless lessons that remain relevant in our contemporary culture. In the years following the Red Summer, there were numerous efforts to reform policing practices, address racial disparities in education and employment, and promote greater understanding between communities. However, many of these initiatives stalled or were ultimately undermined by systematic resistance. Despite these setbacks, the movement for civil rights continued to gain momentum throughout the 20th century. The Montgomery bus boycott, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was one notable example of how ordinary people came together to demand change. Other pivotal moments, such as the March on Washington and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's Freedom Summer, galvanized public opinion and pushed for meaningful reform. In recent years, we've seen a resurgence of activism around issues like Black Lives Matter, police accountability, and economic justice. These movements have drawn inspiration from the past, acknowledging the struggles and sacrifices made by those who came before. By recognizing our shared history and learning from the lessons of the Red Summer, we can continue to build momentum towards a more just and equitable society. As we reflect on this dark chapter in American history, let us not forget the countless individuals whose lives were forever changed or lost in the violence of 1919. Their memories serve as a poignant reminder of the ongoing struggle for racial justice and the crucial importance of continued activism and advocacy. In the final analysis, the Red Summer was not simply a series of tragic events. It was a clarion call to action. By embracing the lessons of this pivotal moment in American history, we can move closer to realizing the promise of true equality and justice for all. As we close our exploration of this critical period, let's carry with us the courage and determination that has defined the struggles of those who have fought for a brighter future. As we conclude our exploration of the Red Summer, a pivotal moment in American history that shook the nation to its core, one lesson stands out above the rest: that systematic racism is not simply a relic of the past. On June 29, 1919, an African-American man named James Spriggs was brutally murdered in Washington, D.C., sparking riots and looting across the city, and marking just one of the sheer scale and brutality of these attacks shocked Americans to their very foundations. Cities like Chicago, Omaha, and Philadelphia saw white mobs wreak havoc on African American communities, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The National Guard was eventually deployed in some cities to quell the violence, but even this did little to stem the tide of hatred and intolerance that had been unleashed. In the aftermath of the Red Summer, there were murmurs of reform. President Woodrow Wilson, who had initially downplayed the significance of the attacks, eventually sent a delegation to meet with African American leaders, including the esteemed Booker T. Washington. But even this gesture was seen by many as too little, too late. As we reflect on these events, it's striking to consider what might have been different if those in power had taken action sooner and more decisively to address the systemic racism that underpinned these attacks. Perhaps, just perhaps, the course of American history would be vastly different today. But instead, we're left with a legacy of pain, suffering, and continued struggle. Now, we ask you, what is it about this story that has resonated with you? Was it the sheer scale of the violence, or the way in which systemicism can masquerade as something else entirely? Or perhaps it was the bravery and resilience of those who fought for justice in the face of overwhelming oppression? Whatever your answer may be, we urge you to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Whether it's a family member, friend, or colleague, we believe that by sharing these stories, we can begin to break down the barriers that still stand between us today. If this story opened your eyes, subscribe to Forgotten History Daily. Every week we uncover the stories they don't want you to know. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and never stop asking questions.